The UK has always been a big breeding ground for wrestling. Yes, from its fervent fan base to its steady stream of excellent talents like William Regal, Zack Sabre, and Drew McIntyre, Great Britain has been able to produce some of the best the industry has had to offer over the years. That said, if you were going to put down one name that best represented UK wrestling, it would probably be Davey Boy Smith, as, with a massively successful career that saw him venture across pretty much every major company there was at the time, he was able to fly the flag for his home country everywhere he went. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in British Bulldog, the Davey Boy Smith Story. David Smith was born on November 27, 1962 in Golborne, Lancashire, England, and despite a popular myth suggesting otherwise, his middle name was not Boy. This just came from Old Northeastern English peculiarity, where the word was added to the end of someone's first name so it could then serve as a nickname for them. And the nickname would stick for Davey Boy throughout his childhood as, growing up in one of the poorer areas of the country, he'd find solace in watching pro wrestling with his siblings Terrence, Joanne, and Tracy, there cheering on the baby faces like Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks as they took on the heels of the day. This then would eventually lead to Smith wanting to get into the ring himself as, after turning 15, he'd begin training, quickly proving there that he had enough natural skill to book himself a spot on ITV's World of Sport, the premier place to see wrestling in the UK at the time. So with a lot of new eyeballs on him, the rookie would start to make a name for himself both as a singles and tag team competitor, quickly rising up the ranks in the former and even at one point almost becoming the British welterweight champion. All while in the latter, he'd be teaming up with his cousin Tom Billington, someone who would go by the ring name of the Dynamite Kid. And that was how, in the early 80s, both men would end up being spotted by Bruce Hart while he was on a talent scouting tour of the UK, with him from there convincing them to come back over to Canada with him as he would be able to find them work with his father's promotion, Stampede Wrestling. Yes, Stampede, the crown of the Canadian wrestling scene run by the legendary patriarch of the Hart family, Stu, was a place that any up-and-comer wanted to learn during this period. And given that Canada remained part of the British Commonwealth at this point, it made it easy for Davey Boy and Tom to get over there, as, now under the tutelage of one of the greatest trainers in the industry, they'd further develop their craft in the infamous Hart family dungeon. And after going through a baptism of fire there, getting stretched out on a daily basis, they'd eventually emerge as new men, ready to take on all comers as, following this, they'd enter into an angle that saw them feud with each other, with Smith eventually getting the win in this program and becoming the Stampede British Commonwealth mid-heavyweight champion in the process. After that, he'd go over to New Japan Pro Wrestling for a tour, where he'd add some strong style skills to his repertoire. Then, once this was done, he'd further add to his growing reputation by reforming his team with the Dynamite Kid, with the two now starting to go by the name the British Bulldogs and becoming the scourge of both the Canadian and Japanese scenes for the next year or so in the process. And all this would ultimately catch the attention of Vince McMahon, who, in 1984, after having only just recently begun his plans for national expansion, was looking to bring in any top talent he could so as to bolster up his ever-growing roster. So seeing the potential of what he was building then, the British Bulldogs would sign on the dotted line with him when he bought out Stampede later that year, with the two becoming full-time WWF roster members going forward as they quickly found themselves to be one of the top teams in the tag division. And the reason for this, of course, was that the two perfectly complemented each other in the ring, with the Dynamite Kid's innovative high-flying style allowing him to throw himself around the ring, all well, with his insane strength and ability to perform power moves, Davey Boy acted as his anchor, keeping the whole ship steady. But it wasn't just in-ring success the Lancashire boy was going through at this point, as by then, in his personal life, he would have fallen in love with and gotten married to Stu Hart's daughter Diana, with the duo having two children, Harry and Georgia, in the years following this. Back in the ring, however, there was no room for love and affection, as the British Bulldogs had one goal, and that was to lay waste to every team in their path, starting with their old Stampede friends, the Hart Foundation, a team made up of Jim Neidhart and Davey Boy's real-life brother-in-law, Bret Hart. And this feud would see both teams wow audiences everywhere they went for the next few months, proving that, even amongst a roster filled with the likes of Hulk Hogan, Rowdy Roddy Piper, and Andre the Giant, they could steal the show from them whenever they needed to. Of course, the Hart Foundation weren't the only team the Bulldogs would face off against at this point though, as they would also find themselves in a program with Greg the Hammer Valentine and Brutus Beefcake leading into WrestleMania 2, with the two sides eventually meeting at that particular show. And as it happened, it was in this very match that after beating their opponents, Davey Boy and the Dynamite Kid would become the WWF Tag Team Champions for the first time. From there, holding on to the belts for the next 9 months as they fended off every challenger that came their way. Ultimately, though, their run would come to an end when, upon meeting their old rivals, the Hart Foundation once more in January of 1987, they'd lose the titles they'd held so dear, as now forced to regroup, they'd enter into programs with a number of teams such as the Islanders, the Rougeau brothers, and Demolition in the months that followed. And as well as this, they'd also gain a mascot around this time, namely a bulldog named Matilda that would accompany them down to the ring and draw big babyface reactions everywhere they went. Sadly, however, their time in WWF would ultimately come to an end in 1988 when, following a number of backstage issues between the notoriously volatile Tom Billington and the Rougeau brothers, the British Bulldogs would exit the company so as to go work elsewhere for a while. Yes, by this point, the Dynamite Kid was gaining a reputation as being a liability, but feeling like he had to stick by his side, Davey Boy would follow him to both All Japan Pro Wrestling and the newly revived Stampede Wrestling from there, where, over the next 2 years, they would continue their run of excellent tag matches against the likes of the Malenkos, the Nasty Boys, and Kenta Kobashi and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi. That said, with Billington's personal issues driving more and more of a wedge between them as time went on, the two would eventually decide to split, with Davey Boy from there returning to WWF, albeit not before trademarking the British Bulldog name for his own exclusive use going forward. And needless to say then, this caused even further friction between the two, but as far as Davey Boy was concerned, he left that part of his life behind, with him now focusing all of his energies on being a single star, something he started doing in October of 1990 when he was reintroduced to WWF fans under the new British Bulldog moniker. So quickly looking to establish himself in this new division then, the Bulldog would start racking up wins over the likes of the Warlord, Haku, and Mr. Perfect during the weeks that followed, becoming one of the most popular mid-card acts in the company in the process, particularly with UK fans, a base that was becoming a larger and larger priority for WWF at that time given the reduced interest they were getting in the US. And hoping to capitalize on the new hometown hero they had, Vince McMahon's company would journey across the pond a number of times over the next couple of years for shows like UK Rampage and Battle Royal at the Albert Hall, with the former seeing Davey Boy pick up a victory over the Berserker and the latter seeing him win the titular Battle Royal. Still, it wouldn't be until the following year that his greatest success to date came as, in 1992, WWF decided to take one of their pay-per-view events outside North America for the first time, hosting SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium in London, England on August 29th of that year. And playing to the native crowd that night, Vince McMahon would put on a special main event that saw the British Bulldog challenge his real-life brother-in-law Bret Hart for the Intercontinental Championship, something that was to be played out in front of the 80,000 frantic fans in attendance, WWF's legit largest ever crowd at that point. Needless to say, this put a lot of pressure on both men, enough to where it would have been easy for them to falter. And to make matters more difficult, in the days leading up to the bout, Davey Boy had gone on a lengthy drug binge with Jim Neidhart that saw him forget everything he'd planned to do on the night. Yes, it wasn't just the Dynamite Kid who had drug issues, as by this point, his former tag team partner's problems were starting to become just as notorious, with his addiction issues likely starting to take over his life. Luckily, however, he was due to be in the ring with Bret Hart, and so, carrying the Bulldog through things, the Hitman was able to work with Davey Boy as the two put on a career-defining performance that saw things end up turning into a 5-star classic by the close of the bout, with the whole thing. Unfortunately though, for anyone who thought this was going to represent the Bulldog climbing the next rung on his way up the ladder to the top, they would be sorely disappointed as, after a fairly nothing run with the IC strap, he'd end up dropping it to Shawn Michaels that November, from there being released from the company altogether after he'd been caught receiving shipments of human growth hormone in the mail. And this, of course, was a huge no-no for Vince McMahon at the time, as it was right in the middle of the steroid trial, a period where the boss couldn't afford any further bad press. So forced to look elsewhere for work now, the Lancashire boy would spend short periods in both Eastern Championship Wrestling and All Japan, all this before signing with World Championship Wrestling in 1993, and there acting as a babyface ally to Sting. And during his time with WCW, Davey Boy would be able to find some level of success, getting to face off against the likes of Sid Vicious and Big Van Vader. Hell, at one point it even looked as though he'd beaten the latter to become the WCW World Champion, all until a dusty finish saw this decision be reversed. Sadly though, personal problems would lead to him being released from his contract later that year as, after getting into a bar fight with someone who was allegedly trying to hit on his wife, WCW would cut ties with him, once again forcing him to look elsewhere for employment. So with its options growing limited, the former Intercontinental Champion would next spend a brief spell in the UK promotion All Star Wrestling, there getting to wrestle a number of local stars such as Jimmy Ocean and Drew McDonald. Come the summer of 1994, however, Davey Boy would have been able to mend fences with WWF, enough so that he would be re-signed with the company and brought back in at that year's SummerSlam to be in attendance during the steel cage match between Bret and Owen Hart. And after this, with the Hart family all choosing sides in this sibling rivalry, Davey Boy would plant his flag firmly on the side of the Hitman, teaming up with him from there as they took on Owen and Jim Neidhart in a number of tag matches over the next few weeks and months. Once this feud ran its course, however, the Englishman would set his sights on new goals, as with the WWE title now on his mind after a failed attempt to win it from Bob Backlund in late 1994, he would vow to win the 1995 Royal Rumble and book himself a slot in the main event at WrestleMania 11. Unfortunately though, despite entering at number 2 that night and going the distance, he would end up being the last man eliminated by the number 1 entrant into the match, Shawn Michaels. And this would see him have to abandon his world title dreams for the time being as, instead, he'd form a tag team with Lex Luger, one that was supposed to portray the combined strength of both the UK and US and go by the name of the Allied Powers. Despite their unity, however, the Allied Powers were never able to make much of a dent in the tag team division, only making 2 pay-per-view appearances. One at WrestleMania when they defeated the Blue Brothers, and another at In Your House 2 The Lumberjacks when they failed to get the better of the then tag team champions Owen Hart and Yokozuna. After that, the team would fizzle away into nothing when Luger quit the company and joined WCW, leaving Davey Boy to have to find new allies as, after failing to win the WWF title from Diesel at In Your House 4 Great White North, and then again from Bret Hart at In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings, he would join up with his family once more when he followed Owen Hart into the Camp Cornette stable. And while this stable would also include the likes of Yokozuna and Vader, it would eventually be the Bulldog and Owen who became the de facto team of the collective, using their real-life chemistry to stand out as one of the best the division had to offer. But that wasn't to say his days as a singles wrestler were over, because in May of 1996 at In Your House 8 Beware of Dog, he'd get another shot at the WWF title when he faced off against then-champion Shawn Michaels. And with this match ultimately ending in a draw that saw no decisive winner, a rematch would be booked for the following month's King of the Ring where, on the same night that Austin 3:16 was being birthed, the Bulldog would fail once again in his attempts to take home the top prize in the company. Yes, it was becoming clear by this point that while Vince McMahon saw Davey Boy as a high-level performer, one who could easily be slotted into the world title scene whenever needed, he just wasn't top champion material in his eyes. And while this must have been frustrating for the former Intercontinental Champion, he had no choice but to grin and bear it, as from there, he would return to tag team action with Owen Hart, with the two even winning the tag team titles from the Smoking Guns later that year. After that, they'd go on a string of successful defenses against the likes of the Legion of Doom and Vader and Mankind, all up until the final point that the boss decided to finally throw a bone his way when, in the finals of a tournament that climaxed in February of 1997, Davey Boy would defeat Owen in an absolutely stellar match to become the inaugural European champion. And so now riding high once more, success would continue to come the Bulldogs' way as not long after this, Bret Hart would reform the Hart Foundation, bringing together himself, Owen, Jim Neidhart, Brian Pillman, and Davey Boy as they became the top heel act in the company for a while and a key part in the Canada vs. America storyline, one of the most unique angles in WWF history that saw the babyface heel alignments shift depending on which country the show was airing from that particular week. So whenever Raw took place in his adopted home country of Canada then, the Bulldog would be treated like a hero. And this would help him to defend his European Championship against the likes of Ken Shamrock in the months that followed. It wouldn't, however, be enough to power him through another defense when, in his actual home country of England at the UK-only pay-per-view One Night Only on September 20th of that year, he would lose the belt to Shawn Michaels, all despite having dedicated the match to his sister prior, someone who was sitting at ringside and dying of cancer. And of course, the reason he'd done this was that, originally, he was supposed to stand tall at the end of the night, the conquering hometown hero doing it for his sixth sibling. In the end, though, HBK would play up to his reputation at the time by using his considerable backstage power to get this changed so that he could win instead, something which only served to heighten the ever-growing real-life tensions between himself and the Hart family. And when all of that came to a head a couple of months later at the November 9th Survivor Series during the infamous Montreal Screwjob, Davey Boy would quit the company in disgust, from there joining Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart in going over to WCW. Sadly, however, by this point in his career, Davey had become so bloated on steroids that his limitations were beginning to outweigh what he could actually do in the ring. And this meant that, while with WCW during 1998, he'd do little of note, usually teaming with Neidhart on the undercard until September of that year, at which point he'd severely injure his back when he took a bump directly onto a trapdoor that had been hidden under the ring for the Ultimate Warrior to appear out of later that night. Then, to make matters worse, Davey Boy, who wasn't told this door was there ahead of time, would get fired by Eric Bischoff while he was still on the shelf, with Eazy-E at the time believing he was embellishing his injury, despite the fact he'd picked up a spinal infection during the recovery process which almost paralyzed him. And as a result of the pain he was in, the former Intercontinental Champion would fall more heavily into drug use, something which continued to worsen even after he was rehired by WWF in 1999. Now with an altered gimmick that saw him come out to the ring in jeans instead of his old Union Jack-adorned gear. Of course this, combined with the fact that his old theme song, Rule Britannia, had been taken away from him as well, left him with little to work with as he tried in vain to get over once more in this new Attitude Era. Unfortunately though, with his injury and drug use limiting what he could do in the ring, it wouldn't be long before the Bulldog was firmly slotted in a jobber to the stars role, losing to the likes of The Rock, all before he would then slide further down the card into the European title division, a belt which had by then become pretty meaningless. Still, even if it didn't hold the prestige it once had, Davey Boy still wanted it back, and on the October 26, 1999 episode of SmackDown, he would get his wish when he was able to defeat the then-champion D'Lo Brown. After that, he'd drop the title, then mill around in the hardcore division for a while, doing little of note up until the point he would be fired on May 27, 2000 after showing up to an event in no condition to perform. And sadly, the bad times would continue on in his personal life too at this point, as around the same time, Davey and his wife Diana would get divorced, with this only sending him spiraling even further into a black pit of despair. But while some held out hope that he'd be able to recover, it ultimately wasn't to be, as on May 18, 2002, he would suffer a fatal heart attack, ending his life at just 39 years old. Yes, it was a sad end and one likely brought on by his years of drug and steroid abuse, but even if the final days of his life were a tragedy, it shouldn't take away from what he was able to do in the ring throughout his career as, being one of the shining examples of the British wrestling scene, Davey Boy Smith was able to fly the flag for the UK everywhere he went and prove that it could be just as good as its American counterpart. And this would inspire many UK performers who came after him, names like Will Ospreay, Pete Dunne, and Nick Aldis, all of whom, had it not been for the inspiration they got from seeing one of their own on their TV screens every week, may never have believed that they could make it in the wrestling business themselves. So while he may have had his personal problems to bear, we should all be thankful for Davey Boy in the end, because ultimately, his story wasn't just about himself. It was about British wrestling, and that makes him a hugely important figure in the history of the industry. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.